intervene or not to intervene.
A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya.
As NATO draws contingency plans,
including potential military options,
and Europe seeks UN authorization,
the current UN mandate does not authorize the use of armed forces.
we ask, is a no-fly zone just the beginning?
The opposition forces have already called for a no-fly zone.
And how will military interference affect Libya and the revolution beyond?
This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. Western powers are once again leading the way towards military intervention in the Arab world. And the pretext, well, more of the same. Surplus morality, global superiority, energy security, right to protect, and a plethora of presumed threats like use of chemical weapons, arming terrorists, genocide, etc. But since recent interventions have complicated and compounded problems rather than solving them, how is a new intervention in Libya going to be any different, considering that NATO has lost all credibility in Arab eyes? I'll be discussing the options with the Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Chairman of FTI Global Affairs and former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Mark Malloch Brown, and Dr. Robin Noblet, Director of the Chatham House in London, and Jan Black, Middle East Editor of the Guardian newspaper. But first, a quick history of military interventions.
The beat is all too familiar.
Once again, we are being tested. In Libya, a regime that has lost legitimacy has declared war on its own people.
It is not acceptable to have a situation where Colonel Gaddafi can be murdering his own people, using aeroplanes and helicopter gunships and the like.
It only underscores how unfit he is to lead and how disconnected he is from reality.
Colonel Gaddafi and those around him must be held accountable for these acts.
Leading to the same refrain.
We're going to squeeze him economically. We're going to squeeze him militarily.
Just no illusions here. It would be a military operation.
A strong and strategic American response is essential.
It's déjà vu all over again.
we're not going to find a peaceful solution to this problem.
Removing Saddam will be a blessing to the Iraqi people.
We will accept no outcome but victory.
Foreign interventions have a long history of not working out, with the disastrous invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Afghanistan that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Why is anyone even talking about interventions?
Essentially, the American project to occupy this country has created a disaster of an epic scale.
The UN-sanctioned US-led Operation Restore Hope in Somalia in 1993 did anything but. No Somalis were saved, American forces were routed, and the country dissolved into a civil war that is still raging. In 1993, when NATO, with the full backing of the UN Security Council, ordered attacks against the Serbs in Bosnia, it failed to prevent the massacres at Srebrenica and other atrocities on the ground. In 1999, in Kosovo, NATO flew tens of thousands of sorties, which only provoked further atrocities and ethnic cleansing.
The prevailing wisdom in the West was, this is not our problem, don't intervene. But hundreds of thousands of people died. And in the end, we had to intervene.
So is it a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, or no intervention in places like Rwanda or the Ivory Coast, and all too much interference for oil-producing countries like Kuwait, Iraq, and Libya? As pundits warn of full-scale civil war, some in the West are advocating military action to protect defenseless Libyans caught in the crossfire.
We need to think of the life of the Libyans first as a priority, so we are asking for the help of the international community under the UN flag.
Cooler heads and more practical politicians may yet prevail.
The Libyans can take care of themselves If the West begins to intervene, then it will backfire.
The Arab League and the African Union have opposed all foreign military intervention. European leaders are scrambling.
We are reluctant to prepare a military intervention in the current context.
It's not our job to change the leader of Libya.
And even the United States appear to be cooling their jets.
There's a lot of, frankly, loose talk about some of these military options, and let's just call a spade a spade. A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya to destroy the air defenses. That's the way you do a no-fly zone.
The longer the conflict goes on, the greater the pressure to intervene becomes. But there is no way of knowing how such interference could affect the homegrown Arab revolution in Libya and the rest of the region.
Secretary General, welcome back to Empire.
You're welcome.
Is NATO preparing contingency plan to intervene in Libya?
No, we are not looking to intervene in Libya.
Are you preparing plan for a no-fly zone in Libya?
No, we have no plans to intervene, and we don't go into details about our planning.
So, Secretary General, do you agree with the assessment of Secretary Gates that any no-fly zone will involve military engagements such as bombarding aerial defenses in Libya?
Well, I will not go into details about the military implications, but I can say that the imposition of a no-fly zone would be a very comprehensive undertaking. It would require quite a number of military assets, and a no-fly zone would be the use of armed forces. And I take note of the fact that the current UN Security Council resolution does not authorize the use of armed forces.
It doesn't really bode very well for Libya if you, under a new UN resolution, intervene or impose a no-fly zone now, does it? Not since Bosnia, not since Kosovo, certainly not since Iraq.
Let me stress that NATO is definitely not looking to intervene in Libya. We have asked our military to conduct necessary planning to be prepared for all eventualities, but we have not taken any operational decision.
How do you think the Arabs would respond to NATO imposing a no-fly zone on Libya?
If at a certain stage NATO is to take operational decisions, there will be three guiding principles for us. Firstly, there must be a demonstrable need for our assistance. Secondly, we will need an appropriate legal basis, and as I said, I assume that any NATO operation would take place in accordance with and pursuant to a UN mandate. And thirdly, we will also need support from the region. And this is a reason why we are in close contact with regional organizations.
And you don't think that we will have another coalition of the willing, meaning a bunch of Western powers taking it on themselves to tackle the situation in Libya without a UN mandate? You categorically think this will not happen?
I feel pretty sure that the international community stands united on the position that the imposition of a no-fly zone would require a clear UN mandate. And I think the Libyan leader watches the international community intensely, and I also think he has taken note of, and I think he should take note of, the very strong measures introduced in the current UN Security Council resolution, because it imposes tough sanctions on the Libyan regime. It introduces an arms embargo against Libya. It provides for humanitarian assistance. It is a quite strong UN Security Council resolution.
Well, Secretary General, thank you so much for joining Empire.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mark, you heard the Secretary General. Do you get a sense, like I did, he was quite on message, but pretty much cautious? Is there reluctance now for the whole intervention idea?
Well, I think he realizes that NATO itself is an absolute lightning rod, and that whatever format some action might take, it would be unlikely to be centered on NATO, whatever the military convenience that its Western members might think it has. I think one's got to step back a little from this, Marwan, and really say, look, the humanitarian impulse to do something is something shared not just by Western television audiences, but audiences all over the region. I think people are horrified to see Gaddafi getting away with bombing his own citizens and civilians. So I don't think one should rubbish the impetus behind this. But I think one does have to say that for it to kind of fall into some unplanned, thin end of the wedge military intervention through a no-fly zone, which over time sucks in a bigger and bigger on-the-ground involvement, would be utterly the wrong way to react to this. So let's find a way of pressuring Gaddafi that all of us, not just the West, can agree to and get to work on doing.
Jan, is the West suited or best suited for it?
Well, everybody knows that the shadow of the war in Iraq in particular hangs heavily over anything of this nature. The ghosts are, you know, they're visible to everybody. We all know what the difficulties are. It seems to me that in the Libyan case, we've encountered something quite different, possibly unique in the extraordinary chain of events of the Arab Spring, the uprisings. Libya hasn't gone according to script. Right. Gaddafi, the bogeyman, is still there. He's fighting. He doesn't show any sign of going away. So I think one shouldn't dismiss the motives of well-meaning people, and indeed of well-meaning politicians, if we accept that such a creature exists, to try to do something. The question is what, and the question is what the people most involved want as well. I mean, I think it would be interesting to explore the extent to which we've heard from the Libyan opposition their wishes for some kind of intervention.
Don't you think this whole idea of a few days for Tunisia, a week for Egypt, and now 18 days for Libya, and everyone is running out of breath? Isn't that a bit strange for revolutions to change regimes?
I think that Libya is different. I think that what we saw, amazing as it's been first in Tunisia, then especially in Egypt because of its size and weight and importance, was an extraordinary.
So we were spoiled by what happened in Egypt.
I think it was quite easy. This is very different, and that's why we're here, and lots of people are scratching their heads about what to do.
So Robin, what will it take? What does an intervention mean in Libya?
No one would look at anything beyond a no-fly zone, I think, at this stage. You said the shadows of Iraq are huge, but so are the shadows of Iraq back in 1991 and the 12-year, the no-fly zone that was meant to be short, which ended up lasting 12 years with Saddam Hussein certainly crushing the Shia in the south and doing a pretty good job of keeping the Kurds in the north under control. So it's not just the kind of intervention, the recent intervention, but even looking back to the history of what looks like an immediate step, then spreading out and infecting in a way the UN as well through the whole UN oil for food program that was put in behind when Saddam Hussein retained himself in position. The fact that then Saudi Arabia was having to host foreign troops. You know, once you get involved in a no-fly zone, it has a sanction element to it. I mean, sanctions take a long time to work their way through. No-fly zones, similarly, are not the absolute answer. I think we have no guarantee that a no-fly zone, even if it were to be imposed tomorrow, which it wouldn't be, or you know, in the next week, would necessarily change the reality on the ground.
Look, the issue has been that over 20 years, the West has always preferred air options to ground options. It thinks there's a kind of no-cost way of solving things where its pilots are at 30,000 feet.
No cost to the West.
No cost to the West, exactly. Yeah. And time after time, this has proven a false military strategy which ends up with some kind of ground involvement. But I think whatever the difficulties of the military side, the political side is even worse. Because really, you know, the political problem is something cooked up in the West is not going to work. This has got to come out of what the neighborhood feels is justified. It's got to be led through a broad combination on the UN Security Council, and we just can't afford, after Iraq, Western NATO freelancing on this.
But I think what's interesting is the fact that the no-fly zone is being talked about in the West, and certainly commentators in the United States, some in Europe as well, are really quite vociferous, quite strongly in favor of it. There's an element of keeping Gaddafi honest in the sense that if there were a use of air power that was visibly seen to have a really dramatic effect in terms of casualties on civilians in some part of Libya, then I think the pressure might change. The responsibility to protect framework that has been called upon by the UN Security Council in its last set of decisions. We're in a slightly different world to the one we were in before. And I think if we over-argue the case out of a no-fly zone, in a way you start to give Gaddafi a different tactical set of options that he can use militarily.
I also wonder whether all this talk isn't, without over-interpreting and attributing greater sophistication than exists in the complexity of daily life and the speed of events, whether it isn't part of an attempt to raise the cost, to send signals, perhaps so that this crisis will end in a different way, with Gaddafi stepping down, with more defections from the regime of military units and so on and so forth.
Why not, Ian? Why not wait until UN Resolution 1970, where the sanctions would bite, where all the other measures?
That's right. I mean, I think we've lost sight of the fact that this is a very good resolution by the standards of these things, and Robin's point that it refers to the responsibility to protect, and that the Arab members of the Security Council and Russia and China went along with this is actually, in its modest way,
it's a major step forward.
It's a major step forward. Plus the set of measures that was adopted in terms of enforcement. Reference to the International Criminal Court of Gaddafi and those around him, the freezing of their assets, the travel ban, the freezing of the sovereign wealth fund assets of Libya.
But there's another point. So a despotic state with which, until very recently, this country in particular enjoyed an extremely cordial and commercially extremely lucrative relationship. It's when William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, went to Tunisia shortly after the uprising there. He was addressing an audience of students and talking about democracy and freedom and the Arab Spring and all those laudable things. And a young woman, a student in the audience, said to him, well, thank you, Mr. British Foreign Secretary, but where have you been for the last 23 years of the Ben Ali dictatorship? Now you have these great ideas. What about before? In the Libyan case, I think a lot of the political reaction is out of genuine embarrassment at the speed of transition from cordial ally back to the mad dog of Tripoli, as Ronald Reagan had him all those years ago.
And speaking of the domestic pressure, what about domestic pressure building up perhaps in Libya later on if the no-fly zone doesn't go very well?
You know, Marwan, I think one's got to just break out of this trap of saying it's nothing or a no-fly zone. You know, you very properly said that this UN Security Council resolution was a pretty good start. It looked desperately slow, as Ian added, compared to the people we're seeing killed on TV. But surely that's the space we've got to be in. We've got this really important idea of responsibility to protect accepted. The international community is saying this is not just Gaddafi's business, what he does to his people. We now need to slowly ratchet up as one, as an international community, the pressure, so that we don't get into that legitimacy problem. It's not that a British or an American plane mistakenly and tragically hits civilians and turns the Libyan population against this. It's got to be that the whole Arab world, with the international community, continues to isolate and pressure this guy. And I think that happens, we will find a resolution.
Robin, how would that work? So why not have a no-fly zone or whatever the next measure is? Not with NATO acting alone, but with some sort of an Arab Western international effort taking place.
I have to say, at the moment, I just don't see how the pieces fall into place to get UN Security Council approval for a no-fly zone.
Do you think there will still possibility of veto?
Oh yeah, I think at the moment certainly. And remember, within NATO itself, not only Italy, which I think has some still ambiguity about the position, but certainly a country like Turkey, NATO member, obviously has a voice on these types of issues. I don't see how without a real change in the context on the ground and really some atrocities that are visibly committed. I mean, Gaddafi.
That's interesting.
That was interesting. Yes. Well, he's gone from being Ceausescu of Romania to being Saddam Hussein in 1991, 1992. But I don't quite see how we make the step right now. The step from the idea of the no-fly zone to the actual decision being able to be taken to pursue it. Countries, Russia, China, etc., are going to want to play this out, I think, to a certain extent, and not find themselves pulled in to actually also being tarred with the military intervention brush.
Ian, I would like to take this to a new level, to another level, which is the level of the region. You started by speaking about the Arab Spring, as it were, because beyond Libya any sort of Americanization of what is going on now in Libya will have a major repercussions on what's next in Yemen, in Bahrain, or other places. So there's something to worry about in terms of the changes that are sweeping in the region.
I mean, the Americans have done some pretty foolish things. It's hard to imagine that they would, at this stage, try to Americanize the first armed response to an Arab revolution that wasn't going well. There's plenty to criticize in what they did. Very faltering steps over Egypt, great confusion, slow over Bahrain. And on this, it seems to me that they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think you actually got to give them a bit more credit on Egypt and Tunisia than they get. This was requiring them to turn on long-time allies. And, you know, I think in a relatively deft way, they actually put pressure on both leaders to step down. So I think, you know, it was 2 down or 2 up for Obama, if you like. And I think that, you know, Libya is much more complicated because they have no such influence over Gaddafi. But you're quite right, Ian. I mean, this would be for them a huge setback to now Americanize the crisis.
I think it's fair to have interests. It's fair for the United States or European countries or Arab countries to have interests and not simply be dragged by domestic political opinion, by the media, by the shots that one sees on television. I would have thought that the interest for Western countries, European in particular, but probably the US as well, is that these changes that take place, not just in Libya, but throughout the Middle East, A, are owned domestically, but B, that they happen, and that we do not go back to a status quo ante.
But speaking of national interest, in democracies don't just act according to national interest. Presumably they should act according to certain values of their citizens, right? And here, what we've noticed the last few days, even right after Egypt, Cameron and the rest of Western leaders were still trying to sell arms to dictators who were going to use them against the people, just like Gaddafi did.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I think, again, you know, praise where praise is due. You know, you can't, on the one hand, criticize the US for wanting a no-fly zone, and then also criticizing it for the mildness of reminding the Saudis of the right of free association. I think, you know, the second is much smarter politics than the first at the moment, and shows, you know, a gentle pressure to just allow a lot more space and oxygen for a domestic civil society in Arab countries, and let the agents of change be the citizens of those countries themselves, but let the change lead to a stable democratic future.
What I sense is there is, even when we deal with the questions of Libya and we deal with the questions of arms sales and so on, I have a sense, Robin, that perhaps Western powers haven't internalized yet the major changes sweeping the Arab world, that they're still doing business as usual, even on the humanitarian level in Libya.
You're right. Well, I think we've been caught by surprise by the style of the revolution, probably because this is not the change that many people expected. They expected the change that would happen perhaps would be driven by radical Islamist groups, that maybe it would be some Iranian influence, that it would have a malign rather than a benign
and it had
flavor
none of
to
that.
it. And I think this is what's taken people most by surprise, that these have been popular uprisings, perhaps driven more by not just young populations, by urbanized populations, by connected population. And this is hard to get your head around.
Particularly because the bogeyman hasn't come out. The Islamists aren't there.
Well, on this possibly hopeful note of changing the narrative, which is what empire is all about, we're going to have to end it, gentlemen. And I'll be back with the final notes. It's only a matter of time. Go, they will. No one in their right mind thinks the Gaddafis have a place in future Libya. The question is, will a Western military intervention hasten or complicate the spread of freedom in Libya and beyond? It's clear that any broad and sustained military campaign will be NATO-American-led. The last time I checked, the UN Security Council doesn't command aircraft carriers or military bases in the Mediterranean. But with a bloody history in the region, why would the Western alliance be trusted with another intervention? Between us, and don't quote me on it, I agree with US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates' wake-up call to those who speak loosely of military interventions. Remember, Westernizing the fight for Libya's freedom will have terrible effect on the future of the revolution in the country and in the entire region. And that's the way it goes. Write to me with your comments and visit our website on the screen below. Until next time.